Yeah. Surprise.
The surprise. I should have asked that like 3 weeks ago. We're live.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Tuesday Talks from the Gordon JCC, but really from our homes. So everything's safe and sound. And we're happy to have you here today. And please stay tuned for all our programs on every Tuesday and every Thursday. We have our concert series. So each week we have a special guest, and this week is no exception. So today's guest is Allison Schacter. She's an associate professor of English and Jewish Studies and chair of the Jewish Studies Department at Vanderbilt. She received her PhD in comparative literature from UC Berkeley. She specializes in modern Jewish literature, including Hebrew, Yiddish, and American. She is the author of Diasporic Modernisms, Hebrew and Yiddish literatures in the 20th century. She just completed a second manuscript entitled Experiments in Prose, Women Writing Jewish Modernity. Did I pronounce that wrong? Right? Did I pronounce that right? Okay. Yeesh. I didn't go to Vanderbilt. This is obvious. She is also a translator from the Yiddish and is currently working on Friedel Stock's, is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Short fiction. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Allison Schacter, and I know this is going to be a special program. So welcome to our Tuesday Talk, Allison.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I really appreciate it. Let's see. Okay. So when folks think about Yiddish literature, the names that most commonly come to mind are maybe Mendele, Sholem Aleichem, Yud Lamed Peretz, Isaac Bashevis Singer. These are the canonized writers of Yiddish literature. Now, this is not only the case for lay readers of Yiddish, but also a product of Yiddish scholarship and Yiddish literary history. In fact, in Yiddish literary history, women are largely absent from the sort of standard narratives, except as poets. We don't see novelists, short story writers, and intellectuals. And yet, women were present, they were publishing, and they were writing. So what I want to talk to you about today is why are women absent from the literary history of Yiddish, and who were the women who were writing in Yiddish? So I'll give you some context and background to kind of understand a little bit of the literary history of Yiddish, and then I'll share with you some contemporary translations of Yiddish women writers, if you're interested in reading them, and talk a little bit about a Yiddish writer very close to my heart who I've been translating, Friedel Stock. And what I'm going to be talking about today is it's linked to a book that I just finished, Experiments in Prose, where I'm writing in that book about the shared literary history of both Hebrew and Yiddish from the perspective of women. So when I'm saying today about Yiddish literature, is actually quite true too for the history of Hebrew modernism, in that we don't tend to see women enter the literary history of prose fiction and Hebrew fiction until really the 1950s, when it becomes Israeli fiction. So, why are women absent from Yiddish literary history, and why until very recently has their work gone untranslated? And until about 5 years ago, I think there was only 2 books by women writers that were translated in their entirety, which is, I think, pretty surprising. So in the early 20th century, women wrote and published Yiddish prose in a variety of periodicals, such as Die Zukunft, Das Neue Land, Vorwärts, which still exists today, Freie Arbeiter Stimme, and so on. In this period, editors of anarchist and socialist papers, which just really means all of the Yiddish press, published the work of women writers because women's literature was considered a symbol of being modern, and it was a way of increasing circulation. Women were writing about women, and this was actually a subject that sold papers. This is what people wanted to be reading about. Among the writers included, especially in the, I'm going to give you the names of a couple of writers from the very early part of the 20th century, were Yenta Serdatsky, Ruchel Brukus, Miriam Karpelov, and Friedel Stock, and all of them published books in the first decades of the 20th century. But even though there are many more writers than I'm listing here, even though there was a flourishing of prose written by women, women writers were still marginalized from literary circles. They were excluded from authoritative roles, and then later, as I said, erased from literary history. In fact, their narrative fiction has been assumed to be superficial, in part because when you write about everyday men's experience, that's considered important. But when you write about everyday women's experience, it's considered domestic fiction or romantic fiction, which interestingly enough, the literature written by men about men's romantic relationships is not considered that and unimportant, or just simply not artistic enough to demand attention. As Norma Fain Pratt has observed, although an increased demand in the Yiddish press for short fiction around 1915 opened doors for many women writers, most of the literary careers of these young women writers although they received some initial excitement and enthusiasm, never matured. So there was all kinds of limits that prevented women who embraced writing from actually flourishing in the literary field. Now, there's a lot of reasons why women failed to thrive in the literary scene. A lack of critical attention. Critics really didn't care what women were writing and were less likely to write about them, or if they were to write about them, not to take them seriously. Barriers to sustaining an independent living. In order to be a writer, you still needed to eat. And so there were a lot of economic hardships that were specific to women, especially women immigrants in New York, and economic pressures that pushed women towards marriage and domestic responsibilities that did not leave much time for writing. In addition, women writers often found themselves isolated without community or support. Public spaces where men went to gain access to support and culture were closed off to women in the first half of the 20th century. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is very different for women poets who were actually part of the larger public discussion about Yiddish literature in the early 20th century and were well recognized by the establishment. They were canonized in a very famous 1928 anthology of Yiddish poetry called Yiddische Dichterinnen, or Yiddish women poets. But although these women were not necessarily seen as central to the poetic tradition, they were recognized as part of the literary present, even if their place was debated. In fact, in the press in this period, there's tons of articles devoted to women's poetry. Was it good? Was it bad? It didn't really matter. It was being recognized. And as a result, Yiddish women's poetry ever since has been widely translated and anthologized in well-known anthologies by Irving Howe and Eliezer Greenberg and Joseph Lethwich. But this is not true. Women's prose was not translated and was excluded from almost all anthologies until probably the 1970s and 80s. And these are anthologies in English, of course. Now, women's complete absence from this literary canon of prose fiction, of novels and short story writing tells us something about the importance of prose for men. In the 19th and 20th centuries, male Jewish writers believed that central to the project of creating a modern Yiddish literature, and you have to imagine that, at the sort of second half of the 19th century, there was a sense that Yiddish, up until this point, that Yiddish was actually not a language of high culture, that it was disdained by educated Jewish men, looked down upon, and that it was referred to by Jews as a jargon. But in the second half of the 19th century, a movement arises to legitimate Yiddish. And male writers believed that in order to create a modern literature in Yiddish, they had to divorce this language from women, that it was a language associated with women. And in order to make it a legitimate language, they had to masculinize it. In the pre-modern period, Yiddish texts were often published with an explicit address to women, even if they were actually meant to be read by men. This legal fiction provided an alibi for men who didn't have the requisite Hebrew literacy. Hebrew textual mastery, the ability to read Hebrew texts, interpret religious texts, was considered in Jewish culture a very prominent symbol of masculinity. And so to admit to reading in Yiddish instead of Hebrew was a threat to masculine identity and a perceived shame. In the modern period, that feminine address adhered to Yiddish, and male writers of the Yiddish Renaissance struggled with the shame of writing in a so-called woman's language. So, and this is a period of time where people are really debating, should we be writing Jewish literature in Hebrew or should we be writing it in Yiddish? And those writers that chose Yiddish chose the language that was the spoken idiom of the majority of Jews living in Eastern Europe. But they had to compete with Hebrew, which was a language that already had an established high status, not only among Jews, but also among non-Jews. And I think these anxieties are really beautifully encapsulated in Yud and Peretz's speech to the 1908 Chernovitz Conference, which was the conference where Yiddish writers declared Yiddish as the national language of the Jewish people. And he stated that Yiddish literature only emerged when Jewish writers divorced Yiddish from clericalism, i.e. Hasidism, and women, allowing Yiddish to evolve from a Mamalotion, a mother tongue, to a Sprach, a language. So male writers were really worried about being seen as feminine, and therefore women writers were a kind of threat to this new literary culture that they wanted to see themselves as creating and being authoritative writers and intellectuals within. So male insecurities and fears shaped women's literary and artistic lives, and I think this continues to probably be true. Male editors limited women's access to publishing venues, precluding women from sharing their literary ambitions and erasing their contributions later from the record. Women had to fight against a traditional male model of cultural production that denied them material support and institutional recognition. Moreover, women's literary networks were thinner, and women were less likely to be part of formal literary institutions. This is sort of how we have such a sparse record of these women. They were less likely to write and publish memoirs and preserve their records, and their families were less likely to preserve their papers. So many women's careers were cut short without time to leave a documentary trail. Scholars often come to these women long after surviving friends and relatives remain alive to offer personal histories. The absence of women in literary history is a product of these archival silences. What records and documents that have survived remain to be pieced together. Now, I think I sort of have said this, but the underlying assumption that's governed the field of modern Jewish culture and literature is actually that women are absent for good reason. They weren't as talented, productive, or significant. When I mention a Jewish woman writer to many colleagues, I'll often be asked, is she really good? This is the big question. But behind this question lies the insidious assumption that any gesture to including women on syllabi or reading lists panders to a feminist recovery project that cares nothing about literary value. However, in noting the absence of women from Jewish intellectual history, the feminist poet and critic Irina Klepvich, she's a really amazing poet too, and her poetry is translated, I highly recommend it, asks, did Eastern European women really not think or write? Did they not have ideas? Were they not part of the intellectual Jewish life of the last 1,000 years? Did a mere handful write only poetry and the rest never have any thoughts about their lives, about the Jewish community, about the broader world? And these questions, I think, still resonate with us 3 decades after she asked them. And I think this is really important because actually the women writers were doing incredibly interesting avant-garde writing. They've just been ignored, and the fact that they've been ignored is now being held against them, right? The assumption has been, oh, well, the critics who ignored them in the 20s or the 40s or the 50s must have been right. So the truth is, this is a real problem for how we understand the story, the larger story of Jewish history and modern Jewish life, because when we're not reading women, we're missing out on the experience of half the population. We only actually have half the story of Jewish cultural modernity. In fact, women experienced modernity different and they wrote about it differently. And returning to their work is about filling out a history that still remains to be written. So during the end of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, Eastern European Jewish women struggled to gain a foothold in a cultural milieu that was undergoing revolutionary changes. Women should have found an easy place in a literary culture that rejected traditional social and gender norms. And this was true. Both Hebrew writers and Yiddish writers, as part of this project of arguing for secularization, actually embraced feminist ideas about women's education, bringing women into into the modern world. This was actually quite central. And they also understood that to create a national literature, you did need a readership that included both men and women. Progressive men embraced women's causes, and they were very invested in the integration of women in the public sphere. Many educated women describe how reading in particular sparked their intellectual curiosity and catalyzed their desire to realize their artistic, intellectual dreams. However, they found some serious barriers to achieving these aspirations. The Russian revolutionary Eva Broido describes how she longed to continue her studies, but women were not allowed entry into the Russian university system. She observes about the many of her friends and the women of her generation, quote, "The thirst for knowledge and learning, for self-improvement and a free unfolding of one's personality, however vague and aimless, was so typical of all of us, that the then current ludicrous term, a young girl of striving, described our condition most aptly." And I think here, Breda captures an era in which new educational possibilities ignited in women the desire to become writers, intellectuals, and artists, but unable to enter and succeed in these fields because of their sex, they were reduced to their desires, right? Reduced to being merely strivers. And sadly, the character of widespread social change just did not match women's ambitions. In her memoir, No Time for Tears, Mary Asya Hilf describes how, despite her advanced studies in Russian and German literature, when she attended her brother's literary circle, the all-male group asked her to sit in a corner. And I think this is a really sad anecdote that, you know, really captures the way that educated women were dealt with in this period. Now, despite these odds, despite all the barriers that women faced, women did write. And so I'm going to share my screen with you. Let me just do this. Hold on. Oop, I have to do it this direction. Share screen. Okay. And then I will. I wanted to share with you, I thought it would be useful to talk first about some of the recent translations that have come out of women's Yiddish writing, and tell you a little bit about some of these writers, maybe whet your taste to dive in to reading some of the really interesting prose that was written. And then I'll talk a little bit about Friedel Stock, who I've written, researched, and translated. So the first book on the left, Diary of a Lonely Girl, was published by Miriam Karpelov in 1918. Initially, it was a serialized novel in the newspaper. She was born in Minsk to a religious family and emigrated to the United States in 1905. So she was born in 1888. She's writing at the same time as Yud Lamed Peretz, as Shalom Aleichem, as Mendele. She debuted her stories in 1906, and many of her stories were about the travails of young women immigrants who were rejecting orthodoxy and embracing the secular world. In fact, Diary of a Lonely Girl is really interesting because it's about the young protagonist whose fictional diaries we're reading, is active in socialist and anarchist scenes. And she's describing and critiquing this culture of free love in which men were arguing for their own sexual freedoms, but at women's expense. And the women characters suffer from these predatory male figures. And I'll say, when I teach this to my undergrads, they really relate to this account, especially my undergraduate women. So I think she was an incredibly prolific writer. Her work appeared in a number of different Yiddish papers, including, and I'll name a few, Freie Arbeiterstimme, Der Tag, Reisekundes, Zukunft, Vorwurf, Heint, etc. She's best known for her serialized novels, but because they were serialized, not many of them in newspapers, right? They would appear weekly in Schacter chunks. Not many of them were published as books. During the 1930s, she was actually a member of the staff of the Vorwärts, but then abruptly left because she had a fight with its editor. And only 5 of her works were published in book form, but I highly recommend Diary of a Lonely Girl. It's a fabulous novel, and the translator, Jessica Kurzan, did an incredible job. So the next book here is A Jewish Refugee in New York, which was written by Kadra Molodowsky, who is probably the best known Yiddish woman writer. And in Israel, she's incredibly popular because her children's poems were translated and her children's stories were translated into Hebrew. So she's very well known, actually. And this is actually a translation of her novel, which was called Von Lublin to New York, Togbuch von Rivke Silberberg. So again, interestingly, another fictional diary. Now, what's interesting about Molodowsky, she was born in 1894, and she actually began her career in Europe. So many of the writers that become popular actually begin writing after they emigrate to the United States. Very few stay in Europe. Bruchel Bruches is one. But Kadra Molodowsky emigrates, but she actually published 3 collections of modernist and very feminist poetry, which has been translated. So if you have an interest in poetry, I highly recommend you also look at that work before she arrived. So she arrived, she was active in both Kiev and Warsaw, and she arrives in New York in 1935 as a kind of big figure in Yiddish literature. And she continues to write poetry. She has and she continues to write poetry even after the Holocaust. She has lots of poems that sort of grapple with the destruction of Eastern European Jewry. She founds a literary journal. It's one of two literary journals in Yiddish that were founded by women. And she basically in the 60s and 70s just runs the whole shop herself, sending out subscription cards, doing all of the editing. It's pretty remarkable. So this is a great novel about a story of a Jewish immigrant girl in New York and how she arrives and becomes and grapples with becoming American. On the landing are stories by a Yiddish writer named Yenta Mash. She was born in 1922 in a region that was once known as Bessarabia, but is now Moldova. And in 1941, she and her parents were exiled to a Siberian labor camp. So she has a very extraordinary story. She escaped in 1948 and spent a number of years living in Kishinev. But in 1977, in her 50s, she emigrates to Israel and settles in Haifa. And it's only then that she begins to write. She writes a number of Yiddish stories that are published in the Yiddish press. She wins the Itzik Monger Prize in 1999. And the David Huffstein Prize in 2002. And her last book was published in 2007, and she died in 2013. And I think these stories are so interesting because they're about a part of Eastern Europe that is not documented in the writings of most of the Yiddish writers in Moldova. And her stories really span the experience of being Jewish in Moldova before World War II, being in Siberian prison camps, and what it's like to emigrate to Israel. The fourth writer, Bluma Lempel, and these are selected stories of both of these writers throughout their career. She was born in the Ukraine, and she also has an interesting story. She received no formal education. Her family didn't think girls needed to be educated. And in 1929, on her way to emigrate to Palestine, she stopped off in Paris to visit her brother, who was actually fleeing political persecution as a communist. And she decided to stay, and she attended night school in Paris, met her husband, and in 1939 emigrated to the United States, where she continued her studies in the new school. She began writing in the 1940s, so another writer that begins a little bit later in life. And she published her stories in the Yiddish press in New York and one novel called Zwischen zwei Welten. And when I was doing a little bit of research on her, somebody made an observation, and I don't know if it's true. A group of people went to interview her in the early 1990s, and she said nobody had ever come to interview her in her whole Yiddish career. The stories are remarkably interesting modernist stories. She's definitely a fascinating character in the history of Yiddish literature. And the fourth writer that I was going to speak with you about, and I'll say a little bit about her, is Fradel Stock. She, at the age of 17, in 1907, she was born in 1890. She actually, and I'll stop my screen share so I can also see the time. She emigrated from a small town in Scala on the border of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when she arrived in New York, she wrote poetry and was actually quite celebrated. Her poems were understood to be, interesting and modernist. She actually wrote some of the first sonnets in Yiddish. And in 1990, she published her first and only collection of short stories at a time when women's prose writing, as I mentioned, was receiving little critical attention. She was actually widely reviewed by many of the important male critics. So by the age of 30, she made her mark on the New York Yiddish literary scene. Reviews of her work were mixed, actually. The reviews of her short story collection were mixed. She got some positives, some negatives, and she was apparently, the story about her is that she stormed in 1990, after reading the poet and editor Aaron Glantz-Leas's reviews of her collection, she stormed into the offices of Der Tog, slapped him across the face, and then broke off all her ties with Yiddish. And then died in a mental hospital shortly thereafter. So the truth, the interesting thing about this story is, like, on the one hand, we can be curious to understand, why was this successful career cut so short? But the truth is, after doing a little bit of archival digging, I can tell you that news of her death was actually premature. She did not leave Yiddish behind in 1919, nor did she die in the 1930s. She, in fact, continued to write in Yiddish, corresponding with the Abe Kahan, who was editor of the reports, and publishing a story in 1942. Although we don't have a clear picture of her life as a writer, we can piece together her struggles in the New York literary scene, relying on official records. And doing that, I've uncovered a more detailed account of her life. And I think what's interesting, she arrived in New York, she lived with relatives. By 1915, she considered herself a poet. That's what she wrote on the census. And at the height of her career in 1918, she actually got married to Simcha Zinn. But by 1923, she was divorced and living alone, or actually living in Washington Heights with another young, aspiring Yiddish writer, Jenny Bedrick. And one hopes that the two women found some kinship and literary community together in their shared home. In 1923, when Bedrick witnessed Schacter's naturalization, she listed her own profession as a stenographer. And although she did publish, her career was very short and really made no impression. So in fact, not only did she not end her career in 1919, she tried her hand as a playwright. This is Schacter. She sold the play to Maurice Schwartz's Yiddish Theater Company, although the play was never performed. And in 1927, she published an English language novel, Musicians Only, which the New York Times described as poor art with remarkably bad writing. So did not go well for her. By the 1930s, she no longer listed her profession as a writer. Instead, in the census, wrote none. She moved in again with her ex-husband in Brooklyn, where he opened a photo studio, and she remained living with him till at least 1940. Her literary ambitions returned in 1942 when she sent Kahan a story actually from Los Angeles. And in 1943, according to her application for a Social Security number, she was living in the Bronx, working for her cousin, Louis Stock, in the garment industry. By 1966, she was institutionalized at the Rockland State Psychiatric Hospital, where she died in 1990 alone without any known family. So this is really a tragic story of an extraordinary writer whose career was cut off. Marrying and divorcing, working as a writer in New York, living with roommates and family, we see a woman economically struggling to support herself while grappling with mental illness. Male critics wrote her off as a hysteric who didn't have the mental stamina of a true artist, and saw her tragic end as almost predetermined, even as she fought against such ends. They declared her dead long before she was dead. And her suffering was definitely amplified by her treatment at the hands of these critics who had trouble accepting women into their circles and who believed that their suffering was a product of their innate tendencies. These beliefs silenced not only Schacter, but countless other women writers who suffered similar fates, whose stories have never been told. And, I think the part of my own work over the past few years has been to try and bring some of these Yiddish women's voices back to, not only to bring them back to print, translating Friedel Schacter, but also to bring them back into the larger scholarly story that we have about Yiddish literature, and to help it guide our understanding of modern Yiddish history and culture. So thank you for listening about these women, and I hope that you'll go out and buy some of those books and read some Yiddish women's writing. Carrie, I think you're muted.
Well, thank you for sharing such interesting stories. And I just want to remind our audience, if you have any questions, please write them in, and we can ask Allison. I can address them to Allison. So if there are any questions, please don't hesitate. We'd love you to participate. So I'm interested actually in how you, you're a writer as well, and how you became interested in Yiddish. I mean, how did you come into this?
The field of Yiddish in general.
Yeah.
Well, I was in a very strange place, actually. I was on a Fulbright in Israel doing research on Holocaust memory and Hebrew literature. And I was taking classes at the Hebrew University, and I wanted to take a class taught in Hebrew. And my advisor said, Avram Novistern teaches this class on Hebrew and Yiddish literature and translation, and it's a great class. And you should take it. And when I arrived in the class, nobody from the Hebrew Lit department showed up. So he said, actually, we're just going to read Yiddish. And you can read it in Hebrew translation or English translation. And, my associations with Yiddish had been like, oh, old-fashioned, old world. But it was this incredibly avant-garde modernist poetry. And so I started studying Yiddish in Israel. And when I started the next year grad school in comparative literature, I continued to study it and became just increasingly interested in the literature.
And as a translator from Yiddish, I speak very, few languages. Spanish I learned through school. But translating a language, language is like those are Romance languages, right? Spanish and Italian, right? Languages. But how difficult is it as a translator to get the essence of to keep the essence of the writer in Yiddish? Is that kind of more problematic, or what's your experience with that?
That's a great question. I think it depends on the writer. Like every writer has their own. I think what happens is there are a couple of very specific challenges when you're translating from Yiddish. How much Jewish terminology do you preserve? Do you translate? There's some examples like, goy. When someone is referring to somebody, do you say non-Jew or do you keep goy? Do you say? There are a couple of instances where the Yiddish term exists in English, and you have to choose: are you gonna keep the Yiddish, or are you gonna stick with an English term? And historically, right? Do you use yarmulke? Do you use kippah? Do you use? There's an English word that's funny that I forget. So, I think you're negotiating Jewish terminology. How much about Jewish culture do you need to translate for your audience? You can't assume that they know certain things. We had a weird thing with money. Like there are all these different Austro-Hungarian terms for coins. I collaborated for the translation of Friedel Stock. I collaborated with a grad school colleague of mine, Jordan Finken, who's also a very accomplished translator, and we collaborated on this together. So we had a lot of back and forths about coinage. So some of it's really small, but I think that part of the work of a translator is to get into the mind of the writer, and then you do your best to recreate the story in English, but it's mediated. And we worked really hard to capture some of the things we tried to highlight the things about her, the stylistic details of her work that we found the most compelling, and always bring those out as a way of trying to get at it. But yeah, I think that, how Jewish you make the translation, which is a kind of funny way to put it, is the question.
Right, because I would imagine the translator is always striving to keep the essence, and so the balance of it all, especially since it's right. So here's a question: does Allison know of any Yiddish book clubs that exist now?
Not in Nashville. I do not. There was a historic Yiddish book club. There used to be one. I saw in the archives, I think, that are located in the JCC building. But there's always a possibility that Yiddish book clubs that are virtual across the country. And if people are interested in creating one, they should, I'd be happy to be a resource for that.
I've worked at the Gordon JCC for 17 years, and Esther Loeb, she used to teach Yiddish. I remember. She was a Holocaust survivor, and there were definitely people interested in keeping Yiddish alive in our Jewish community. And right now, I don't know that we have any classes, but we definitely did have that. Not so much a book club. So I was, while you were speaking, I was thinking of, because I'm from New York and all, and I just find it. So, what was the atmosphere like? Well, I guess that's what you did touch upon that, but I was just kind of trying to imagine in New York, like being a Yiddish writer, like how big was this circle of Yiddish writers in New York at the time? Like, was it just like a tiny fraction? It seems like to me in my mind, it's like a tiny fraction of cultural arts in general.
Well, I think in the early part of the 20th century, people valued literature and literary culture. It was popular. You could make a living off it if you were, especially if you were published in the Vorwärts. There were, there was a lively Yiddish theater culture and literary culture. There were cafes or really cafeterias where Yiddish writers hung out together, different spaces that they, largely the men hung out in these public cafe spaces. I don't have numbers for you, but I think, there were hundreds of writers, probably, like, how many of them succeeded and we remember their names is different, but there was definitely a robust culture of Yiddish writers.
How hard was it, difficult was it to find the women though, in there, like how, so you, this is what your whole talk really to me was about, was that everything was repressed really with women. I mean, they would just, it was like they were disregarded and their work maybe burned and thrown out and who knows what, from their families. And so where are new works now still emerging that families are finding, in like, people pass away and then all of a sudden they find a trunk and then it's all of a sudden like, what? And, how do they find
that hasn't, I mean, when I was researching Friedel Schuck, I found relatives of hers because I became really interested in the story of how, people thought she was dead. And in fact, Irina Klefrich wrote a poem about her. Like, and I think she was still alive through 1990. And to me, it's such a great tragedy that nobody knew. So I contacted relatives and they did not know of her, actually. And I was trying to get her psychiatric records to find out a little bit more, but in New York State, you have to have a family member. And in the end, I haven't heard back from them about that. There's what is a lot of women's writing was published in its day in journals and newspapers. So there are scholars that have gone back and are starting to do some of the recovery work of like reading these serialized novels that were never published. And there's now an interest in among translators and translating this work and bringing it to our attention. I mean, it's a delay, the project of bringing forth like forgotten women writers in other languages and literatures, including English, has happened a long time ago, but in Yiddish, for a variety of different reasons, it's been a later phenomenon.
Are there other cities in the United States that, back in the day, when all of this was flourishing, that were also like Chicago, like
Chicago had a Yiddish scene with interesting writers. LA, Malka Chefetz Tussman lived in LA, and LA had a robust scene. Cleveland has something of a scene. And Canada, Montreal was a very, Rachel Korn, who was Kaja Molodowski's close friend, and I'm right now writing about, they have a very robust correspondence that I've become interested in. So they were good friends, and she lived in Montreal.
So, it's so sad about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's still so fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
What was so fascinating about her life, though, was the support of her husband, right? I mean, that's like the fact that he was such a liberated male to give her the room and the freedom and the support to excel. And so were there any other men that came, were kind of in that time that was really helped to celebrate? Or there were publishers that were really interested, or was it really just a big fight for women?
Kaja Molodowski's husband was incredibly supportive of her career and played a supporting role. He published in her journal, so he would be an example. I mean, that's an interesting question in the book that I'm writing. With the Hebrew women, right? Like, so Friedel Schuck had a very bumpy marriage, and we don't know much about it. And Devorah Fogel, who's another Yiddish writer I write about, she wasn't allowed to marry her love, Bruno Schultz, who is probably the most well-known Polish writer, who was a modernist writer. And then
to marry him?
Her parents didn't think he was a good match. They wanted her to marry a businessman, and so she did. And I think that in many ways hampered her career. She writes about the burdens of motherhood and the domestic trifles that take her away from writing. Also, it's an interesting contrast in Hebrew are these two writers, Devorah Baron and Elisha Bichovsky, whereas Devorah Baron's husband, who was an editor, was always thwarting her and never publishing her stuff. Elisha Bichovsky's husband created a printing press, like a publishing house, just to publish her stuff. And she became, for a time, one of the most popular Hebrew poets. So I think that women were more dependent on men than, and so the story of marriage for women is more relevant in some ways than it is when we read about male writers, whether they had wives or not. There's always someone taking care of them, or the wives are there. The assumption is they're making their career possible.
And do you find as a professor that there's an emergence of new Yiddish? Is that even possible? Is that happening? An emergence of Yiddish young writers?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, it's well, Yiddish is live and well in like Borough Park. So among Hasidim, right, Yiddish is the language, and it's a growing population. And there is actually a genre of like pulp fiction and Yiddish that the Hasidic community has published and sells, and it's like usually it's knockoffs of classics. So Jules Verne's 80 Days Around the World, some fake version of that. I think there are some interesting people doing projects in different places, translating from Welsh into Yiddish, translating Baudelaire into Yiddish. There are some younger people engaging in Yiddish, but I wouldn't say that there's like a thriving Yiddish literature. There's a lot of excitement and interest in Yiddish culture. There has been, I'd say, for the past 20, 30 years, a different Klez camp. People are interested in learning it. Klezmer revival. There's a lot of different aspects of Yiddish culture. People are drawn to it because part of it is a connection between Yiddish and queer, but then there's also Yiddish as a kind of national Jewish identity. I know I have two colleagues who are actually raising their children speaking Yiddish, which is interesting. Not at Vanderbilt, but.
I can't help but think of that TV series I watched, Orthodox.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, because it's also, again, about the story of a woman, finding her voice.
Yeah.
Right. It's always it's just the eternal struggle.
Kind of an old story. It's interesting that, the story continues of women who break free and the cost to themselves and the fight to keep their children. And many women who do become writers have to leave their families. Like there's accounts of different Yiddish women and writers who do that. I think Yenta Serdatsky actually walks away from her family and then emigrates to the US to become a writer.
The life of a writer. Well, writers have always interested me as creative people because it's such a internal, it's really an isolated type of creative process, I think. When I think of, I came here as a songwriter, so I have that aspect of myself. So I understand what that takes to really focus as a writer. And so to write novels, and I have a good friend who's written the Perez Family, Christian Bell, my friend wrote into a movie, and just the life of a writer. And then of course, like you spoke about, women, trying to juggle, any creative woman trying to juggle family and their creative process. I mean, that in itself is a whole topic because, but that really is underlying what you're talking about, where, being a woman and now this, so the whole world is finally, let's hope, moving in this direction where we embrace women as equal. I mean, it still feels like we're still fighting for some crazy reason, But so anyway, this topic is so fascinating from so many different angles. I want to see if we have any other questions. Any other questions?
While you look, I just wanted to add something. I think it's a great parallel to think about songwriting culture in Nashville and Yiddish literary culture in New York in the early 20th century, and that lots of people come and they want to make it and they participate in it, right? And there's so many different ways in Nashville you can imagine yourself a songwriter. Everybody understands it and recognizes it as this aspiration. Not everybody makes it, but the culture, I think, is robust, and that would be a way to think about Yiddish literature in New York. I don't think people thought they were always going to make a living in it, but they were, it was like a thing to do, like coming to Nashville, being a songwriter.
Right. That's true. When you're a creative person, whether you become famous or not, it's really the process. You do that because that's who you are. You find your circle. When I moved here 27 years ago in Nashville, it was really it was kind of like the boys club. In a way, I think it's changing, but I don't know. I kind of walked out of it a little, a couple of years back. Actually, when I became a mom, so I was kind of right there in your story of being, becoming a mom and then kind of balance it all. But it's the world at large has been a boys' club on so many levels. You know, women have definitely had to fight hard to find their place. Yeah. That's an interesting analogy of Nashville to New York in that way.
And then when you think about the barriers of women to access, right? Like when you think about the subtle ways that women don't gain access to the same resources, the same opportunities, and all those small things, I think it's hard sometimes to know how to document those, but they're real and they're true institutional barriers to women's success. And that is mirrored, you know, in different creative communities across.
Right. Do you have your book that you could kind of hold up and or to put on the screen for our readers?
Well, my book of translations is not out yet, so it's at the press. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. But you did write. You are the author of the book that you did write.
The Diasporic Modernisms. Do I have a copy? It might not be in my house. Actually, It might be. I don't think I have a copy of Diasporic Modernisms here.
If somebody was interested to read that, where could they find it?
Yes, you can find it on Amazon. Just looking up. I think my name might have been spelled wrong actually in the announcement. I just noticed that it's Schacchter, but you can find me at Vanderbilt Jewish Studies, and you can buy the book on Amazon or Oxford University Press.
Do you have a website as well that anybody?
Just at Vanderbilt, my Vanderbilt faculty website. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you are an interesting person in, you know, that I always find it fascinating, people who just writers and professors and how they come on their own path to who they are. So, you know, it's part of the story too. So I don't see any other questions for today. Is there anything else that you'd like to sum up, or when do you expect your book to be finished that you're working on right now?
The manuscript is due back in December, and then it'll come out probably 9 months. So not for a year. It'll be out next year.
9 months.
Yeah, exactly. Another baby. Yeah, I know. I just think, you know, it's really important to read women and to buy books authored by women that you should be reading and buying, and recognizing that the language that's used to describe women's writing is always less exuberant, less likely to really capture. So don't always, you know, just read women. I think that's how I'd want to end.
That's a perfect ending for today's talk, and we thank you so much for your time and your expertise and your knowledge and your gift of being here today. So thank you
so much, Carrie. It was